Okay, welcome back to the Investigative Journal on this March 21st, 2016 day on our calendar. I'm your host, Greg Anthony, and you're listening to FirstAmendmentRadio.com. You can listen to my show every evening from 6 p.m. to 7 p.m. That's on FirstAmendmentRadio.com or at 11 a.m. Pacific Time, or you can go to my website at ArcticBeacon.com. That's ArcticBeacon.com. Today I'm going to spend the whole show talking about something called Operation Gladio. Translated means gladiator. We've talked about this before, and I think it's vitally important that people understand this, and also understand how they've been led by the nose by all these presidential candidates when they mention the war on drugs and what they're going to do to stop it, all these different programs. It is a bunch of hogwash. They're not dealing with the truth, how the American government, how the cartels, how big drug dealers on the streets, and also the Vatican work together to bring in these drugs to our country, not only to basically hurt the American people, hurt the people of the world, but to create an enormous profit. And they used this money to fund they used it to fund rebel organizations during the communist scare, during the Cold War. Then they continue with something now called, you might as well just call it Operation Gladio B, to fund terrorism. So let's see how this really operates. We've talked about it before, and I've compiled two clips today that I want to play. The first one I can get through, it's only 4 minutes. Second one's about 2 hours. First one is just basically called Operation Gladio, the Secret War, and it's a real good synopsis of what was going on during the 80s. Then I'm going to play a 2-hour, and we won't be able to finish it today, but a 2-hour presentation by the BBC on this subject. Interesting that we didn't see much of it here in America. Now, how this really works is basically, if you believe that wars are orchestrated, for example, Pope Pius XII was instrumental in working with Hitler, putting him in power, and if you understand that the powers that be, the hidden agenda, control both sides of every war, once Hitler was disposed of, they were already planning communism, and to build up communism again to fight so-called free democracy. And if you grew up during that period of time, you remember the big, huge communist scare all over the place. They were going to nuke us, etc., etc. Kids in school were taught to go. We used to do drills where we'd hide under our desks. And little did we know that all of this was orchestrated by our own government, and, in my case, the religion that I was growing up in. I was in a Catholic school. But I got a whole completely different story, and did for many, many years, as did many, many millions of Americans. But here's the way it really works. And let me back up. We're not going to start in the 80s. We're going to go back to right after the World War II, when they were already planning the Cold War. And Pope Pius XII in Rome sat with James Jesus Angleton and a couple other high-up OSS officers. That was the precursor of the CIA, which you could either call the Catholic Intelligence Agency or the Central Intelligence Agency. Both apply. And what happened here was they were already trying to figure out how to create this enormous chaos, this chaotic adventure now of how to fight communism in all countries all over the world. So they figured out they had to create rebel organizations to do this. And what they would do is figure out they could always go into these countries using the Jesuits as spies and create this rebel organization to fight this to overthrow these communist countries all over the world. So you had this kind of thesis, antithesis working out so they could create their synthesis in the end, and that is money, power, control of countries, wealth, you name it. So here's what they were looking at. They said, well, boy, this is going to cost us a lot of money. How are we going to fund this? And how are we going to keep this away from the prying eyes of the federal auditors and so forth, bank auditors, so forth and so on, the Congress, etc., etc.? Well, as the CIA was formed, here's what they did. They looked at China, and they saw Chiang Kai-shek and Mao Zedong battling it out, and the rulers that be needed to find a way to stop the aggressors. So they came up with the idea to sell drugs to their own people, make a lot of money to arm themselves, and use this money to fight off the aggressors. well, a bell went off in the head of Angleton, and he said, can't we do the same thing? And that's exactly what they did back then. They first started in Burma. Burma was their first, well, let's just call them the killing fields of war. That's where they grew all of the poppies and the things they needed to sell these drugs into Europe, into America, etc., etc. Then they needed to devise a plan after making these drugs to sell them. So they would have, of course, the big cartels working now, and of course on the surface they would be fighting against them when in fact they were working together. And then they needed big drug dealers in our country and Europe to sell these drugs, and the CIA, of course, controlling this would give them a profit, the government gets a profit, and then a lot of money was starting to be amassed so they could arm these rebels, create this counterinsurgency in these countries to basically overthrow leaders, to create this kind of conflict, this chaos that they always wanted to do during that period of time. So once the money started rolling in hand over fist, they had a problem. How to keep this away from the federal auditors, how to keep this away from prying eyes. And basically what they did was they decided to use the Vatican Bank as a money laundering operation, that's exactly what it became, one of the biggest money laundering operations in the world. And here's exactly how they operated. The Vatican would take 15%, they would wash the money clean because there are no controls on that bank, and then send it out clean all over the world. And so now they had their game working, and let me tell you, it amassed a lot of money, and they still do the same thing today to fund terrorism. Now, during the 80s, now let me give you my story so you understand why I have a vested interest in this case. I was working in Rome during that time of strategy of tension where where the government and the Vatican and everyone was working together to fund terrorism. So here's exactly what happened. I would see these terrorist events, Bologna, the American bookstores, and even the American newspaper where I worked. And I told you the story about how I was 3 seconds away from death, almost blown up in the bombing of the American newspaper. I presented you the UPI story regarding that verifies it. And at the time I didn't realize that the Vatican, that newspaper was actually owned by the CIA, and it was an inside job. I found that out after I realized I was seconds away from death, and the bomb was placed there by supposedly this left-wing terrorist organization that was opposing Reagan's visit to Italy, and that happened about 10 days before he was to arrive. So basically, I began to research this whole story and found out, based on the fact of what happened to me, I wanted to know the truth about how they funded terrorism, how they did it back then, and how they used the drug money to do this, Operation Gladio. So let's go to this 4-minute clip that picks it up during the 80s, and I may have to do a little bit of translating here, but this talks a little bit about that strategy of tension in Italy at the time when I exactly was there and almost killed because of Operation Gladio.
From UFOs to psychic powers and government conspiracies, history is riddled with unexplained events. You can turn back now or learn the stuff they don't want you to know. Here are the facts. In 1984, an Italian judge named Felice Casson and his colleagues questioned a terrorist named Vincenzo Vinciguerra about a 1972 car bombing in Petano and a 1980 bombing in Bologna. This Petano bombing had originally been blamed on a communist group called the Red Brigades, but Casson noticed troubling anomalies in the case. Vinciguerra's testimony traced the crime to a right-wing group called Ordine Nuovo, or New Order, of which he was a member. Eventually, he received a life sentence for the 1972 bombing, but his testimony and Casson's investigation led to something much, much bigger. A shadowy collaboration that connected Freemasonry, terrorism, and intelligence agencies in numerous countries, a web that led across borders and oceans all the way to the U.S. government. Here's where it gets crazy. The story starts decades ago, in the aftermath of World War II. The uneasy alliance between Western powers and the Soviet sphere quickly deteriorated. Both regimes believed the other would inevitably attempt to expand, sparking a war for global supremacy. Working through NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, the West established stay-behind armies that were, in theory, waiting to respond in case of a future Soviet invasion. This program was called Operation Gladio, and for most of its history it didn't exist, not officially. The countries with stay-behind armies included at least 17 nations other than Italy, some of which were not members of NATO at the time. In 1990, then Italian Prime Minister Giulio Andreotti admitted the existence of Gladio in Italy while denying that these secret armies were involved in any terrorist activity. However, that's not the story Vinciguerra told. Instead, the ex-terrorist said that his organization was supported by Gladio, supplied with weapons from secret caches, and ordered to perpetrate false flag attacks that could be used to vilify left-wing or communist groups. And, at the time, it's important to note that left-wing groups were growing in popularity. This news caused a furor in Italy as more and more witnesses came forward, alleging that a great deal of Italy's terrorist attacks were actually bankrolled by intelligence agencies working in concert with the infamous propaganda do. In his 1990 speech, Prime Minister Andreotti said that Gladio had been dismantled and, in any case, never participated in any terrorist acts. But was it true? Whistleblower Sybil Edmonds claims that Gladio soldiers on in the form of a program called Gladio B, this time involving U.S. intelligence, the Pentagon, and Al-Qaeda. Some dismiss her allegations as nonsense, while others wonder why there wasn't more investigation of this in the mainstream news. Today, much of the details of Gladio, the original one at least, remain classified, isolated somewhere in the murky, opaque quagmire of national security. Why is that? What exactly did Gladio do? Did it ever end? For now, that's something quite a few people don't want you to know.
Okay, this short little clip kind of explained exactly what I was talking about. I was talking more about, after looking in depth into this story, how they raised the money to create these organizations, both the rebel organizations in countries like Nicaragua, etc., and much of the money in Vietnam like that, too, when that strategy attention was going on there. And then morphing into this war on terrorism. During the time I was there in the 80s, they were testing this out in Italy, and now they've honed their skills and doing it all over the world. That regional terrorism was going on there. Now it's basically global terrorism, but the same format is used. They have to raise the money, they have to money launder it, and then they have to keep it away from prying eyes, all using, this cloak of national security, the CIA. And those are the questions that should be asked of your candidates when it comes to the war on drugs. Now, if you think about this, back in the early 50s and before that, there was a limited amount of people on drugs in this country compared to what happened in the 60s and 70s, and how it's blown out of proportion now. The more people that get hooked on drugs, the more drugs are coming into this country, and the more money that they are making to fund groups like ISIS now, Al-Qaeda, etc. Now, let's go to I've talked about this many times. Now, you might wonder, I was there when it was going on in Italy. I saw it first up. I was also almost killed because of this situation. The bombing in the newspaper that I was in, and I walked right by the bomb, and luckily went downstairs, and then it blew up. Me and this other guy were the only guys in the building at the time. It had to be an inside job. I checked out afterwards. And it was just lucky I wasn't in that hallway 3 seconds later, or I wouldn't be talking to you now. Well, later in the day, this left or right-wing terror organization supposedly called up and said they were fighting against this hangman Reagan. So it's that tension, that strategy of tension. But when I found out that actually my government, the religion I was brought up in, were behind all this, that can make you a little bit weary of believing anything these guys do in the future. And so basically, from that one morning when I was almost killed, has kind of patterned my life. And I don't believe one word that any of them say. So when your presidential candidates start talking about this subject, please, somebody ask them about this. Just say, what about Operation Gladio? They'll give you some kind of double talk. But they'll at least know that they're lying. Now, the BBC did this documentary. I haven't listened to all of it, so let's see what they have to say. Now, you're going to hear a lot of foreign language because they talked to a lot of these whistleblowers during this period of time that were blowing the whistle on Gladio. And I can try to do the translation, and we will attempt to get this done. And this should take up the remainder of this half hour and the whole second half hour.
Of international terrorism now on BBC Two. In the first of 3 programs, Time Watch traces the often brutal work and political influence of the Gladio network of secret agents.
Deception, folks, is a state of mind, and the mind of the state. That was stated by James Jesus Angleton, head of the CIA counterintelligence, 54 through 1974. One day a man came to my house and asked me if I would accept a confidential mission. He said that it was something with the framework of NATO. This is Michael Van Sant, a Belgium Gladio member. He didn't explain much. It was advisable not to be too specific. Because of this was one of the most secret organizations that has ever existed. We had a radio at our disposal. Our base was near London, with a second base near Boston. Decimo Garo, trainer capo maggiore, the Gladio base. I work with special American, English, French, and Belgium units. Normally, these exercises involved dropping special forces who came directly from France, Belgium, or England. They were parachuted in, and the men we had trained guided them down to the ground, and then helped them get to safe houses. Vincenzo Vinciguerra, former member of Gladio. Gladio, as defined nowadays, forms part of what I've always referred to as parallel structures. That is, not poised for battle against a hypothetical invader, but rather one meant to be used internally against what the military have always called the fifth column of the USSR, the Communist Party, and the extreme left.
For 40 years, secret terrorist organizations, many trained by Western intelligence agencies, have manipulated the political control of European sovereign states by a campaign of terror and murder. Originally part of a secret network, these groups changed from being defenders of state security into attackers of the established political order. Until 2 years ago, that secret network was generally known by the single word, Gladio. On November the 9th, 1990, the Prime Minister of Italy, Giulio Andreotti, revealed to his own parliament and the world the existence of a top-secret European-wide network of secret agents. It was called Gladio. This network of stay-behind groups was intended to fight a Soviet invasion of Western Europe. Andreotti's announcement led to an immediate reaction in the capitals of Europe. The suspicion was that some parts of the Gladio structures were involved in internal subversion.
Nous avons été saisis de la question du stay behind belge, qu'on a appelé la question Gladio.
By what they call Gladio, this organization operated. This is Senator Roger Lamont, head of Belgium Security. Scandal unleashed after that revelation of stay-behinds in Italy. Our Minister of Defense was called by his Italian colleague, who wanted to know what decisions had been taken. In the last meeting of the European stay-behind, Minister Guy Combe, Belgian Minister of Defense, said this: November 1990, an Italian delegation came to ask me if I knew what Gladio was. I didn't know anything, except that on that very day, I read about it in an Italian newspaper on the flight to Brussels. In this way, I learned of this scandal in Italy called Gladio. The minister let this amazing detail be known that he didn't know that a stay-behind existed in the Belgian army and the state security. Gladio has always been protected. There is one clear example. Senator Libero Galtieri, head of Italian Parliament. Moro was called to testify. Aldo Moro. They asked if he knew of a parallel secret structure inside the services. And Moro asked the services what sort of answer he should give. And they told him it didn't exist, and so Moro said, part of the Swiss authorities knew of the existence of this structure. Head of Swiss Parliament inquiry into this Gladio problem. Some MPs and a secret council had some control, but it was ineffective, because these MPs knew virtually nothing. This parallel structure used the extreme right. This is one of the whistleblowers again from Italy, for the simple reason that they fought the communists. In 1945, the Second World War ended and the Third World War started.
The autumn of 1944. Benito Mussolini would be dead in 6 months. Adolf Hitler in less than a year. As the Allied armies advanced on the capitals of Axis-occupied Europe, the other war, the secret war of agents and partisan groups that had always been part of the bigger war, was to reach its own climax.
Okay, we're going to take a break right now and come back and listen to more of this BBC documentary on Gladio. Much of what happened here was behind the scenes, and I think the premise that where did they get the money is really interesting, and the one that isn't really focused on in this documentary. We'll be back in 3 minutes on the Investigative Journal, and perhaps look into that portion of the Operation Gladio, the money portion that really involves the Vatican Bank. I happened to be there during the biggest scandal in the 80s, and how it is the biggest, one of the biggest money laundering operations in the world. Back in 3 minutes on the Investigative Journal.
Visit crosstheborder.org, C-R-O-S-S, crosstheborder.org, to get your print, EPUB, or PDF version of the book, The Rapture Will Be Canceled. That's crosstheborder.org.
I know you all want answers, and believe me, so do I, and I'll do my best to get them.
Despite Nicolas Cage's promise to do his best to get left behind rapture answers for us, don't hold your breath. Not everyone believes Left Behind is true prophecy. Some may even regard as conspiratorial the mainstream re-release of the Left Behind movie with actor Nicolas Cage portraying the main character, as an attempt to further reinforce in the minds of all this perception of false prophecy, in order to condition the masses for the play about to begin. If you want true Bible prophecy answers, get the book, The Rapture Will Be Canceled. The author exposes the Latin rapture origin, the 7-year tribulation deception, true Bible revelation of Daniel's 70 weeks, the abomination of desolation, the restrainer, America in the Revelation, the image of the beast and the mark of the beast, and the truth about God's chosen people, and so much more about Bible prophecy. This book will shatter the left-behind paradigm of future events. Get the book, The Rapture Will Be Canceled. Visit crosstheborder.org, CROSS, crosstheborder.org, to get your print, EPUB, or PDF version of the book, The Rapture Will Be Canceled. That's crosstheborder.org.
The program you are listening to is 100% sponsored by you, the listener, on this First Amendment Rights Media channel. You will notice that there are few commercials on this radio network. There's a good reason for that. Corporate advertising dollars come with strings that limit program content. So without your help, these programs cannot continue on internet or our several affiliates. If you benefit by the educational law programs, we ask you to give. If you are admonished or nurtured by the Bible and ministry programs, we ask you to give. If some voice a cause that you are passionate about, we ask you to give. If you believe in any of these, we ask you to support them as you would a missionary on a continual basis, as if giving a tithe for missionary radio. These programs are not commercially viable and must be supported by those faithful to the cause of truth. Look for the button to sponsor your favorite programs at our listen and schedule pages on the internet. Then, when you subscribe, we will send you the last quarterly MP3 CD of that program immediately, and continue to do so with each new quarter. We will also give you unlimited archive access to all of our programs. We're asking you to give much less than a tithe, so that you may also send support directly to a particular program host, cause, and anywhere else the Spirit may lead you. Do all to the glory of our God and Creator, for His holy nation, the only kingdom that will last forever. Thank you for listening.
Okay, we're back for the second half hour of the Investigative Journal on this March 21st, Monday, 2016 day on our calendar. I'm going to take a little deviation away from that BBC presentation and hit the nail right on the head here with Bill Hughes, a presentation he gave called Papacy, CIA, Heroin, and the War. Bill Hughes has been a guest on my show many, many times in years past, so please listen up to what he has to say.
Tells us that the Bible and the great controversy are not true. And when a world tells me that, I'm going to search and find any and all information that I can that says the Bible and the great controversy are true. We're going to be looking this morning at part 2 in this little series in Prophecy Arise, part 7, on the papacy, the CIA, drugs, and war. If you remember the last time we looked at this, we realized that during World War II, the Jesuit order and the Catholic Church that controlled Russia and Joseph Stalin pushed him to spread communism throughout the world. And that's exactly what we've lived through over the last 50 years. In fact, as I think back on my childhood, there is still one event I remember as a 4-year-old child. I remember going out in my garage. My dad was out there and he had bags of canned goods. And I said, "Dad, what are you doing with all these cans?" He said, "Son, there might be a nuclear war between the Soviet Union and America. The Soviet Union are bringing atomic warheads, and they are bringing them to Cuba, and John F. Kennedy and the United States are telling Khrushchev if he crosses a certain line, there will be a confrontation." Now, how many of you remember that? Nellie, do you remember that? You remember that. Jim, you remember that. Okay, I was 4 at that time. I still remember that experience. The Jesuits who controlled Joseph Stalin pushed him to spread communism around the world. Franklin Roosevelt, who was a member of the Council on Foreign Relations, which is a Jesuit organization, they pushed him to stop the spread of communism. As a result, Ronald Reagan in the 1980s, we all remember it, he said that the Soviet Union was the evil empire. We all remember that, don't we? The 1980s, the evil empire. But the United States at the very same time is known around the world, especially in Muslim countries, as the what? The Great Satan. So, folk, in this Cold War that we lived through, the Soviet Union looked bad, the United States looked bad. And who, in the midst of this horrific conflict, who has looked better and better each and every day? Who has looked better? The papacy. The papacy. Now, folk, the creation in the United States, the agency that was created during World War II, it was originally called the OSS. It evolved into what we know today of as the CIA. Now, we know it as the Central Intelligence Agency. The truth be told, it's the Catholic Intelligence Agency. Why? Because it was Bill Donovan who began the CIA under the name of the OSS. He was a devout Catholic ordained by Pope Pius XII to create this organization to stop the spread of communism. In order to do that, and the way the CIA did that, was they gathered men in countries around the world, in Germany, in Korea, in Central America, in Canada. They gathered men and they said, "We will pay you, we will feed you, we will arm you, we will house you, as long as you will help us to fight communism if it comes into your country." So these pockets of men, these cells of men, became fighters on behalf of the Catholic Intelligence Agency. But where do you get the money to house, feed, arm all of these men all over the world? Where do you get the money to do that? Well, it didn't come from the United States. So the Catholic Intelligence Agency looked for another place in order to fund this humongous operation of stopping the spread of communism. The place that they found where they could do it, they learned it from Chiang Kai-shek in China, who was fighting against Mao Zedong in the rise of red communism in China. Chiang Kai-shek did it from the Shan Plateau in Burma, where they were growing poppies that would then be used to produce heroin. Chiang Kai-shek got the heroin from the Shan Plateau in Burma, took that money, took that heroin, sold it to Chinese people, made millions and millions of dollars in order to fund his war against Mao Zedong. The Catholic Intelligence Agency said, well, we can do that too. So they started getting drugs from Southeast Asia, and they sold them in the inner cities and the ghettos of New York, Miami, Chicago, Detroit, Los Angeles, till finally it just was bursting at the seams to where drugs became available all over America to fund wars against communism. Now, folk, I don't believe there's a person in this room that has not been affected by the spread of drugs. I know I was. I was terribly affected by the proliferation of the drug culture in America, and it came from the Catholic Intelligence Agency. That's where it came from. Well, we come into the 1970s, something very significant happened in America at that time. I was an 18-year-old senior in high school, but something that had crippled America for nearly 20 years was ending, and that was a horrific war in Vietnam. It was also at that time that not only did Saigon fall in 1975, but the extremely fertile poppy-growing regions in Burma, the Shan Plateau, were facing a severe drought, and the papacy would need a new area to produce heroin to continue their push for an old world order. You say, wait a minute, Bill, you made a mistake there. It's not the old world order, it's the new world order. No, I didn't make a mistake. The new world order today, folk, is simply a revival of what went on through the Dark Ages. So we are seeing a revival of the old world order in which the papacy ruled the earth. It's nothing new about it. It's the old world order. Now, where would they get the drugs to finance war and the stopping of the spread of communism in the world? Where would they get the drugs? The place they found where poppies had been grown prior to this was in the Helmand Valley of guess where? Afghanistan. Have you ever heard about Afghanistan? Has America had any involvement in Afghanistan? Has anything happened in America that has triggered America going into Afghanistan? To all of those questions, we could answer yes. There's an area in Afghanistan, it's called the Helmand Valley. Here's a picture of it. You can see it's hilly, but this area here, folk, you could probably throw your shoe into the ground and out would come up Converse or Nike shoes. It's a prolific growing region in the world. They had tried growing poppies to make heroin. It had grown there prolifically. That was the region they chose. In fact, it's called the Golden Crescent. It's right where Afghanistan, Iran, and Pakistan converge. Right here is the Helmand Valley. And drugs started flowing out of this valley area at the tune of about 3 million. I didn't say $3, and I didn't say $3,000. I said $3 million an hour. Now, folk, I'm fortunate if I have $30 in my wallet, okay? I feel like I'm doing pretty good if I've got 30 in my wallet, okay? We're talking $3 million an hour of heroin was being grown right here, starting in the late 70s, late 1970s. That area, it's known as the Golden Crescent, where those three nations, Afghanistan, Pakistan, and Iran, come together, had wonderfully rich soil. Poppies for heroin had grown there successfully, but not on the scale needed by the papacy and the Catholic Intelligence Agency. In the mid-70s, it was an area of vineyards, wheat, and cotton, but that was about to change, and change big time. Big time. Well, there was a problem, though. There was a problem. And folk, you know, we are hypnotized, lied to, deceived, that when some leader in some country dies and he's assassinated, we're told, well, that was because of some weirdo fanatic that lost his job, and he was angry, and so he killed the guy. It doesn't work that way, folk. Leaders are not killed because some guy that's making, $5 an hour is mad, and he somehow can maneuver himself so that he can kill some. It doesn't work that way. Leaders are killed because they oppose the authority of Rome. That's why they're killed. Now, this man right here was leading Afghanistan in the 1970s, latter part. His name was Nur Mohammed Taraki. Now, he wanted to get rid of the production of all heroin growing in the Golden Crescent. There wasn't a lot at that time, but he wanted to get rid of it. Now, Taraki didn't realize what he was up against. But the Muslims, Taraki was kind of a liberal Muslim. There were Muslims in the area of the Golden Crescent where the heroin was grown who wanted to maintain their old beliefs. They wanted women, to wear their covering so that only their eyes would be visible. Now, we don't see that. Maybe an extremely rare occasion here in America. You go over to Egypt, folk, and you've got women walking down the street, and all you can see, you can't even see their eyes. The slits are so thin. That's old Islamic religion. There were Muslims in the area of the Golden Crescent who wanted to maintain old beliefs. They wanted it to be where if somebody went in and stole a piece of candy in a store, their hand was cut off. That's what the Muslims in the Golden Crescent wanted. But Taraki, he wanted to get rid of the old beliefs, the Muslims in the area, and the heroin. Taraki wasn't very popular. A group was formed by the Catholic Intelligence Agency. A group of militant Muslims were formed to fight against Taraki. Why? They needed the drugs. They needed the heroin. So they created a cell of Muslim militant men who were dedicated to creating a pure Islamic state. Does that sound familiar to you? Have you ever heard that before? Somebody wanting to establish a pure Islamic state? Have you heard that? What is ISIS? They want to establish a pure Islamic state. Well, in the 1970s, a group was formed in Afghanistan called Hezbollah-e-Islami. It was backed by the papacy and the CIA. They're the ones who funded it. They're the ones who created it. Why? Because they said these militant Muslims, yeah, their ideas are goofy about a pure Islamic state, but they'll fight for us so that we can have our drugs coming out of that region. The militant Muslims clashed with Taraki's government. During this time in 1978, the production of heroin rose to 1,200 tons. Taraki, surprise, surprise, he was assassinated in September of 1979. And a pro-West papal and Catholic intelligence agency man, a man by the name of Hafizullah Amin, was put into power. In December of 1979, Russia invaded Afghanistan. They didn't want a Western Muslim at their back door. This was perfect. This is exactly what the Catholic Intelligence Agency wanted. They wanted Russia to invade because they wanted to create these armed Muslim men to fight against the Soviet Union and to grow prolifically the poppies for heroin. The stage was set for a clash between the Soviet Union and the Catholic Intelligence Agency-led forces that could be trained in Afghanistan. Now, guess what one of the names of one of those cells of militant Muslims, guess what it was called that the Catholic Intelligence Agency created in Afghanistan to fight against the Soviets? Guess what it was called? It was called Al-Qaeda. Have you heard of Al-Qaeda? That's when it was created. Al-Qaeda is an arm of the Catholic Intelligence Agency. And an offshoot of Al-Qaeda that was later formed by the Catholic Intelligence Agency was called what Dennis just said. It was called ISIS. ISIS and Al-Qaeda were creations of the Catholic Intelligence Agency. One of the major leaders of the Catholic Intelligence Agency that led the forces in Afghanistan was who? It was Osama bin Laden. The conflict with the Soviets began in early 1980, many of the Muslim fighters were trained in the Middle East. But guess what? Many of them were trained in America and still are today. Because the need for fighters became paramount, many black Americans were recruited by the Catholic intelligence agency. Now you say, well, Bill, why do you stress here black Americans? Well, think about it, friends. In the ghettos of American cities, broken homes, drugs, murder, rape, you name it, not getting a fair shake, as Martin Luther King Jr. called it, that America had given the black community a blank check. Okay? So many black Americans are upset and disillusioned by America and American religion. So where do they turn? Well, here's an alternative. You can join up with Islam. You can become a Muslim. And then, not only become a Muslim, but we will get you out of the ghetto. We will pay you a good amount of money. We will take care of you if you will simply go fight in our war in Afghanistan. The Catholic Intelligence Agency got what it wanted. The Holy War had begun for the next decade, all through from 1980 to 1990. Heroin, black aid amounting to more than $3 billion would be poured into Afghanistan to support the Holy Warriors, making it the most expensive covert operation in U.S. history.
Okay, we'll pick this up later in the week on the Investigative Journal. Good night.
Since the beginning of time, kings have sought it, nations have fought for it. It has been traded, it has been borrowed, it has been purchased, it has been stolen. There's a reason for it. To secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and to our posterity. Invest with the security of gold and silver. Call Discount Gold and Silver Trading at 1-800-375-4188 or visit discountgoldandsilvertrading.net. Listen to Financial Survival with your host Melody Cedarstrom right here on FirstAmendmentRadio.com at 4 p.m. Eastern or 1 p.m. Pacific Time. Visit discountgoldandsilvertrading.net or call Discount Gold and Silver Trading at 1-800-375-4188. Toll free 1-800-375-4188.